Hello there, welcome back to another Heffy Doodle video. This is Cassie and I'm so super excited to be sharing a nighttime fall card using these awesome products by Heffy Doodle. We have the Hootiful Stamp and Die, the Grassy border die, the Forest Builders die, along with the strips of ease dies. We're going to start off by doing some ink blending, and I've sped this up a bit because it's ink blending and it takes a while. I'm starting with some watercolor paper because I do want to do some splattering. And I'm using the Distress Oxide color, old paper, and then I'm going to work my way up. The next color I'm going to grab is Shabby Shutters, and I'm just blending this with my mini ink blending tools, and then I'm going to go back and forth until I have the blend that I want. My next color would be Peacock Feathers, and I know this isn't really looking very nighttime right now, but believe me, it will get there. And then I'm going to move in with some Chipped Sapphire. Here's where we start to bring in some of that nighttime. So I'm doing that on the sides and then bringing back in the Peacock Feathers, and then I'm going to come around the edges a little bit with that Chipped Sapphire, and then we're going to end up using some Black Soot. So that'll really start to bring in that nighttime feel, and then we'll just go back and smooth out that blend a bit more. I want to add a little bit of water to it, so I'm just going to use a water bottle and spritz that all over that background, let that sit for a few seconds, and then I'll just take my microfiber cloth and I'll wipe that up. For my grass, I have another piece of that watercolor cardstock, and I'm coloring that with some Rusty Hinge, so I'm just blending that all over that background. And then here's a little tip for you. When you're using Distress Oxides, or any inks for that matter, they can stay wet as they sit on that paper or soak in. So I always use a heat tool, because with this I also plan to do my die cutting with that Grassy border die. And because I want to do that through my die cutting machine, I don't want it to be too moist because it could tear the paper. And also, here's another tip for you. Before you run that through, because I used that ink, I'm going to use just a piece of scrap paper right over the top of that. When I've got my grass border where I want it to be, I'll just use a piece of scrap paper, preferably one that's clean. Mine just has some marker on it. And then I'm going to run that through my die cutting machine so that if any that ink transfers, it's going to transfer onto the paper rather than my die plates. All right, so now we have our borders, and it doesn't bother me that I've cut them through because I'm going to layer those. I've grabbed just my Black Soot and I just did my edges just a little bit with that Black Soot, and now we're ready to start assembling my background. I'm using some liquid glue to adhere down that grass, and then I'm just putting it on the top and on those bottoms, and I'm going to let that dry for a second, and then I'll just use my scissors to cut off all of that excess so that everything will be nice and flush to the card. This panel was 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, so it will cover the whole front of an A2 size card. And then our background is done, and so we will move on to doing some stamping. As I said before, we're going to be using the Hootiful Stamp and Die, and this stamp is so cute. Those little owls and their little expressions are just too much for me. So in my Mini Misty, I have grabbed some alcohol-friendly paper, and I'm inking up my stamps with Memento Tuxedo black ink. That's, again, alcohol marker friendly because I plan to do some Copic coloring. And I'm going to put up all the colors on the screen for you, and I won't show you all of the owls because I color them the exact same. I did stamp them out twice because I wasn't sure exactly how many of those I wanted to use, and I had the paper to do it. So I'm starting off with E55, which is my lightest color. I'm going to move in with some E57 for his little feathers and just to do some shadowing on that E55. I tend to like to go lightest to darkest because that works best for me in the way the coloring. I know that there are quite a few people that like to do darkest to lightest. They say it saves time, but for me, I never end up getting a good blend. So I say you do what works for you. Try both and see what works better. So I'll just show you these two little owls that I'm coloring, and then I'll blend out where I've put some shading on that E55. I'm going to blend that out again with the E55, and I'm going to come in with a darker color, which is the E89, and that will be my darkest shade. And then I'll blend that out with that E57. And then we will go on and do the other little guy doing the same thing. I don't have an actual light source. I'm just putting down the darker shades where I feel like it would look best. And then blending that out. Once again, bringing in just a little bit on the top of his head, blending that out. And then for his beak and his little toes, I'm going to use YR04. I'm going to move on to the stump now. To color the stump, I'm using E99 as my base, because I thought about using the same, similar colors to the owls, but I wanted the stump to stand out. My darker shade is E49, and I'm just bringing it in just a little bit, trying to add some more of that texture to the outside of the trunk. And then I'll do a little bit on the ring on the outside edges once I've blended this, trying to give it a little bit of a rounded feel. Blend that out, and then we're going to move on to using our dies. So I'm going to use just some low-tack tape to tape down my dies over the top of each of those little owls. And I'll obviously have to run this through a couple times so I can get all those owls cut out. And then once they're all tacked down, I will run that through my die cutting machine. And here they are, all cut out. And I love the little white border around them. For my sentiment, I have grabbed some Heffy Doodle Oreo Crunch cardstock, and I'm going to stamp out my sentiment using some Versamark ink, which is just a clear sticky ink. I used a magic powder bag over the back of that because I do plan to put some embossing powder over the top, and I don't want that embossing powder sticking to places I don't want it. I stamp it out a couple times, and then I'm going to cover that with some fine detail white embossing powder. And then I'm going to heat set that till that is smooth and melted, and you'll be able to tell because you can hold it up in the light and it'll be shiny. It'll go from a matte finish to a shiny finish. And then I will rub away that excess powder bag, and I'm going to grab that Strips of Ease die. Because I did not get this sentiment straight, I'm just going to tack down that Strips of Ease die, and then I will have my sentiment all straight and perfect. I've got some heavyweight cardstock that I'm going to use as my card base that I scored at 5.5 inches. I had cut it down to 4.25 by 11 inches and then scored it at 5.5. I want to make sure that my panel stays down. This is a heavy piece of watercolor paper, so I am just using some 1/8 inch score tape on the back of my panel. Typically I like to use liquid glue, but this works fine. So I will line it up to the top, and then I will press the rest of it down. I decided I did want to do some stamping on the inside, so I grabbed another sentiment from the set, and I'm going to ink that up with some chipped sapphire distress oxide ink. So it says, "You are Hootiful." And I did back my sentiment and all of my owls with some foam tape. So I'll peel off the back of the foam tape on my sentiment. I'm going to use a T-ruler to line up my sentiment on the top. I do have a little bit of excess, so I will open that up and trim off the excess. And then we'll get ready to start adhering the rest of our little owls to the front. So I'll put down the little stump, kind of lining up my owls, and I'll tack those down to the front of the card. I love how it looks like they're just all flying around. Fun little fall night for these guys. And then for a final bit of embellishment on the outside of the card, because I do go on to do some more on the inside, I grabbed some Nuvo glitter drops in the color Night Sky. So these are a glitter drop, and they're a deep blue. Because I did those drops right on the top of that Distress Oxide ink, I do run the risk of the drops reactivating that ink and kind of bringing that ink into it, but I'm not so concerned because this is a darker Nuvo drop. I'm deciding which ones I want to put on the inside, and if I had been thinking, I would have done it ahead of putting the Nuvo drops on, but hindsight. So I will take some of my liquid glue and adhere both of those little owls to the inside, and then that's going to finish off our card here. So I would love it if you liked this video and started subscribing if you haven't already done so. There's always lots going on here. Come find me on social media. I'll have links down below in the description box, and find Heffy Doodle and follow them as well. And as always, thanks for stopping by.